All right. A couple of announcements before we get going. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to this webinar with the Hymn Society. This is a webinar format, so if you're wondering how to show your video or what's going on there, no one can show their videos except for the presenters, but you are more than welcome to take advantage of the chat function, which works the same way as a Zoom meeting does. And also, if you want to ask questions, you can use the chat for that. But there's also a Q&A button down there that looks just like the chat button, but it says Q&A. You can use that function to kind of formally submit questions that you would like to ask. And then if we have time at the end, then we can start fielding those. Or Dr. Robyn, if you want to check in on that as you go, that's totally up to you. So to introduce our presenter today is one of our new board members, the Director of Research, Dr. Steph Budway. So Steph, take it away.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to be with you all, and it's an honor and privilege to have the opportunity to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Robyn. I can never say enough great things about Dr. Robyn, and so I'm so excited that you are all with us today and that you get to hear Dr. Robyn speak to the wonderful folks in the Hymn Society. I think it's going to be an amazing event, and I've had the great privilege of working with Dr. Robyn here in Nashville and having them come to my classes at Vanderbilt. So I know that you're all in for a wonderful, wonderful and rich conversation. So Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, PhD, has been described in a myriad of ways: a scholar activist, scholar leader, thought leader, teacher, public theologian, ethicist, poet of moral reason, and word artist. Among these ways of describing Dr. Robyn, they are also a visionary thinker who has spent 2 decades working in the borderlands of church, academy, and movements, seeking to not only disrupt but dismantle supremacy culture by focusing their PhD studies on new concepts of being and becoming, decolonizing knowledge production, and bridging with radical difference. They enflesh a deep hope of collaborating in these borderland spaces where their work seeks to contribute to the ongoing work of collective liberation. Dr. Robyn is the founder of the Activist Theology Project, a Nashville-based collaborative project that seeks to work with the dominant culture and produces curriculum at the intersection of scholarship and activism. Activist theology, as a disciplinary offshoot of liberation theology and movement idea, has been incubating since 2008 with Dr. Robyn and further developed throughout their doctoral program and engagement with movement leaders. Dr. Robyn was named one of 10 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress in 2018. As a scholar activist, Dr. Robyn is committed to translating theory to action so that our work in the borderlands reflect the deep spiritual work of transforming self to transforming the world. Dr. Robyn writes and creates both academic and other valuable resources, including digital resources. Dr. Robyn is a non-binary Transqueer Latinx who calls Nashville, Tennessee home. They are the author of Activist Theology from 2019, published by Fortress Press, and the forthcoming book, Becoming and Bodied. Dear friends, it is a great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza.
Thank you so much, Dr. Budway. It's always great to be introduced by friends because they humanize you in a really particular way. And so thank you so much for just inviting me into the conversation. I know that the Hymn Society has been doing these webinars that have centered around race, class, gender, and I don't need to remind you or anyone that we're living in fraught times, that we are living in a time where these categories of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and so forth are causing harm. And considering that I come to the Hymn Society as a philosophical theologian, not as a homiletician, not as a worship professor, but as someone who actually looks at ideas and theory and seeks to steward a better narrative. And so what I'd really like to do is talk about the importance of narrative in our worship practices, in our liturgies, in our activism, in our embodiment, right? Because it's all liturgy. And the reason why I want to talk about narrative, and I'd really love to limit my comments so that we can have a broader conversation, because I really believe in the pedagogy of conversation. So please put your questions in the chat, and maybe Brian or Steph can moderate that and help me with that. One of the reasons why I want to talk about narrative is because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters to people is story. And I have to wonder, what is the story we are stewarding in our congregations, in our classrooms, in our writings, in our publications? What is the story that we are stewarding? One of the stories that I like to share when I begin talking to anyone is that I am coming to you from a land that is so-called Nashville, a land that was stewarded by Cherokee, Shawnee, and Yuchi people, indigenous peoples who had a practice of stewarding land in a very particular way. And when we talk about narrative and when we talk about stewarding story, are we stewarding the ancestral stories that impact our theologies, our ethics, our practices, our embodiments, our liturgies? So much of the tradition rests in the realm of ancestral wisdom. And do we steward that narrative as ancestral wisdom, or do we steward it as fact, as dogma? I think the difference is our capacity for hospitality for difference. And so the reason why I think narrative is so important is because when we address all the isms in life, racism, classism, ableism, etc., we have to steward a story that actually creates hospitality for those who are unlike us, for those who maybe are stewarding a different story. One of the great privileges I have is working with Muslim leaders, Buddhist leaders, and those of no faith. And I'm always curious about their story. What brings them to interreligious or interfaith work? What is the story that compels them to participate in a narrative of difference? And so one of the things that I think is so important in our work as Christian theologians, and I think we're all theologians, because theology is really for the people, not for the institution. If we are all theologians, then are we stewarding the kind of story that is going to create conditions for hospitality? The ways in which I was socialized in congregational life was in Baptist life, in the ELCA, and in the Episcopal Church. And we know that all three of those traditions have gone through a pretty significant revision when it comes to the story of the hymns and the narrative that is being stewarded. So we know that for some people, they have opted in to use a hymnal that reduces the use of male language for God. That's a That's a way that we can steward hospitality in our congregations to expand the vision of who and what God is. And why I think this is important is because our practices matter. I write in my book, Activist Theology, that I could give two shits what you believe, but I care about your practices. I care about your politics. Why that is important is because your politics tell a story. And if our stories are about practices of justice, or as I have recently been thinking about it, habits as ritual as justice, then we know that we are stewarding a narrative, we are stewarding a story that is creating conditions for the multiplicity of differences to emerge. We have to remember that we are entangled in this world. We are entangled in the challenges of this current moment. Our entire country here in the United States is a hotspot for coronavirus. My family has been impacted by coronavirus, chosen in blood. And I sit here in Nashville, quarantined, thinking about how do we steward, as Christian theologians, how do we steward a narrative of healing? How do we steward a narrative of hospitality? And how do we steward a narrative of justice? I think it's in our rituals. So many people have gone without the ritual of the Eucharist, for example. I reached out to a clergy friend of mine who is a neighbor right over here, and we had communion in the round on Sunday. And it was a story for me that was very important because we need the practices to keep us well. And I think that as things are changing so fast in our congregational life, we have to ask ourselves, what are those practices that we are keeping? What are the practices that we are revising? What are the practices that we are reimagining? And what is the story that we are stewarding with those practices? I would really love to hear from y'all. What are the practices that y'all are stewarding? What are the stories that are bubbling up in your communities? And how might a different story create conditions for justice and equity and liberation? So that is a question that I have for y'all that I'd love for y'all to reflect on, and maybe we can have a larger conversation about that. The other thing that I want to say related to story is that story happens in our bodies. Stories are not just ideas floating around. We are not just heads floating around. We are not just bodies in the world floating in space. We are actually real material beings, and story is scripted in us. We know that our tradition speaks to community, and that anthropology speaks to belonging. We are built to be in community with one another. And if our bodies carry a story, if our bodies carry maybe the stories of our ancestors, if you will, how do we practice those stories in a way that invites equity and justice and liberation when it comes to these categories of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc.? We know that the logic of dominance is the very thing that is harming each of our communities. And we're all conscripted into that logic, by the way. None of us are immune from white supremacy. None of us are immune from the umbrella of supremacy culture. We are all conscripted into that. The talons of supremacy culture are embedded in us. But what is the story of our own bodies? How are we embodying our narrative? What are the habits of our story? You see, when we practice habits, we are creating ritual. And when we create ritual, we have a choice of whether those rituals are justice-making and equitable or not. And so I would really love for y'all to reflect on the stories that you embody. What is the narrative that you are practicing? Do you have a practice? When I talk about practice, I'm not talking about your practice of maybe the first thing you do is drink a cup of coffee. Certainly that is a practice. But when I ask about practice, I'm asking about what are the practices that you were stewarding in your life to create conditions for a more liberative political future, a more liberative, equitable future. What are those practices? Are those practices in pastoral care? Are those practices in liturgy making? Are those practices in the ways in which we offer ourselves to our communities? Or are you stewarding other practices? I'd really love to know what those practices are. We continue apace in this long and drawn out election season. And we know that this republic is crumbling on the inside. But we also know that we have a different future as Christians, that we believe in the future of God. We believe in the future economy of God. And that is why narrative and story is so important, because if we try to steward our democracy in the vein of the future of God, we might achieve a more functional democracy. That's not to say that I think that we would have to talk about Christian supremacy and the hegemony of those things. Yes. What I am also saying is, if our practices of Christianity, if our practices of the Christian tradition are able to bear fruit in ourselves and interpersonally, then we can steward a cultural body that can impact our democracy. That's not to say that it would impact the institutional church, because we know the institutional church is its own form of supremacy culture, right? Institutions are part of the breadth of supremacy culture. So when I'm talking about a democracy or an economy of God, I'm really talking about a cultural body. We know that these categories, race, class, gender, sexuality, require us to steward a better narrative about ourselves, both in practice and in our institutions. I recently have been toying with a term that may be evocative or may actually be offensive to some people, but that word is abolition. And abolition just means life-affirming systems or life-affirming institutions. So can we actually steward abolitionist practices that steward life-affirming systems or life-affirming institutions? Where does your church fall or your congregation fall on that spectrum of life-affirming or life-denying? This is an important question when we think about story and narrative, because we need to discern, and remember, the practice of discernment as part of our theology in the world, it should be primary. We need to discern how faithful we are to these small things, like curating life-affirming situations and life-affirming institutions. I think that we have to be focused on what has happened in the past and what ancestors are pushing us into the future. But we also have to pay attention to the story of the present and where our practices are taking us. If we believe in the future of God and in the future economy of the divine, then can we steward stories that help make that so? I think that I want to pause there and see if there are any questions. I do see a little bit in the chat here. Thank you for mentioning Resmaa Menakem. I have a high respect for Resmaa Menakem's work. Read that book, My Grandmother's Hands, and yeah, it will change your entire world. I'd really love to see if there are any questions about story or narrative or stewarding our purposeful stories. And if there aren't any questions, I would love for us to be in greater conversation. Yes, Brian.
I actually have one since no one else has popped up so far. As you were talking about narrative and structures and things, one of the things that the Hymn Society, I think, prides itself on is when hymnal committees do their work for various denominations or for other hymnals that aren't necessarily attached to a denomination. A lot of the committee members tend to be a part of the Hymn Society, because part of what we do is we gather those folks who are doing that kind of work. And it struck me that what they are doing is essentially interpreting the narrative for a pretty large group of people, and how big of a responsibility that is, not only to look at the past and to decide which parts to tell, but then how to shape the future narrative, which in some ways I guess is kind of guesswork, because we don't exactly know how certain songs are going to be used within a liturgy and what that does to the narrative. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. That's not necessarily a question, I guess, but more of a musing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that train of thought, because I was actually wondering how many of the people on here are actually part of committees that
I can poll the audience,
that are actually part of making these decisions, because this is the exact thing that I'm talking about. How do we steward justice? How do we steward equity when we have such a big tradition, and how do we steward difference as part of that practice, right? Because I think in my lifetime, I have seen varying communities really struggle with what is handed to them, because we've not taken into consideration the cultural responsibility of our narrative. If that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm going to launch a poll so that we can find out.
Great. This is exciting. I've never done a poll on Zoom.
So this is asking everyone, which have you been or are you currently a part of? And the choices are a past hymnal committee, a current hymnal committee, choosing hymns or songs for my church, and choosing hymns or songs for my publisher or other kind of song gathering group. I would consider that like, Music That Makes Community. They've put together a song collection. The Hymn Society has had groups that have put together special collections, things like that.
I love this by Ana Hernandez. I steward justice and equity by letting some tunes and text die. Yes, that is part of stewarding justice, right? Is we all participate in the death process, and the dying can be what is so painful for communities. But that is part of the work. Okay, so 94% of the folks are choosing hymn songs for my church. So we could actually have a really robust conversation about how do we choose stories for our communities that steward, justice and equity and liberation. How do we do that? What is our practice? What is the discernment practice for that? What are our resources for that? How do we steward our discernment in a collective manner? right? Like if one person is responsible for choosing hymns, how do we actually distribute that leadership so that it's a collective form of choosing? Welcome from the UK. Yes, Ana Hernandez, the death of triumphalism and patriarchy are liberative for many of us. Yes. Yes, learning and communicating context from those who would have the stories. Yeah, I mean, I tell I'm on faculty at Duke Divinity School, and I tell my classes there that if we are theologians in training, then we all have a contribution to make. And myself as the one who is responsible for stewarding the class, I'm not the only expert because I'm not the only one in that class with lived experience. I think that we could pivot that in our congregational settings to where there's less of a passive educational context to more of an active a thicker we context, to where we can steward the right kinds of stories. Yeah, many of our congregations are still deeply patriarchal and racist. There's a long, patient, loving work. Yeah, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. This is the long haul. It's part of the work that I do at the Activist Theology Project to steward stories that will create conditions for social healing. And I think that our congregation should be a part of that work of social healing, because social healing isn't just in society, it's also in our churches, because bodies of the world make up our congregations. So yes, this is patient, loving work that needs to be done. Thank you, Janet. Are there other questions about story? And maybe Brian, you can help me see them all. I've got the chat up, but I may miss some things. I'd love to hear from folks. Yeah, I think I'm just going to read this. I don't know if y'all are reading this. Being willing to risk songs that will make some uncomfortable is an underlying virtue. Yeah, we need to think about what goods can emerge from stewarding justice or stewarding equity. And I think that one of the goods that can emerge is this underlying virtue of people just simply becoming uncomfortable and wrestling with their own internalized bullshit, right? We all have it. And I don't use a filter on these things because I'm just trying to be real with you. We have got to figure out how to, what in my family call in conjunto, we've got to figure out how to steward togetherness from a leadership perspective and from a practice perspective.
Robyn, get back on. As we talk about this, for those, as you've seen, many of us are in leadership positions of choosing the hymns, congregational songs, and as important as I think that collective we is, I think as some of the comments have mentioned, that's also a bit of a challenge. I think if maybe you could talk a little bit about the education that needs to be done. While it's important, particularly if you have a diverse congregation or trying to have a diversity of cultural influences. But yeah, if, for instance, here in the South, you're in a very white church with folks who are very stuck in their ways, that collective we might not as easily move towards liberation. So I wonder if you could say something about how those of us who are in leadership could help educate or maybe move those who are part of that collective we but are very stuck in non-liberating perspectives as regards to race, class, and gender and sex, and how they're reflected in the songs we sing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think context matters in all of what we do. And if we take the South, the American South, which is pretty much stuck in their ways, white people need to be doing white people work. We have got to be educating one another, and we've got to be stewarding the right kinds of stories to create conditions for new stories to be invited in. And so, you know, one of the things that Resmaa Menakem says is gather together for, 7 to 10 years, a group of white folks. And at the end of year 3, figure out who is left in that circle, who is willing to stick it out. And at the end of 7 to 10 years, you will have stewarded a different culture in that small group. And that culture can be blueprinted into churches. So I think churches churches have got to be able to be places of belonging. They've got to be places where relationships are created. If churches are only a place where you go and you learn dogma, I would say that's just bad theology. And we're stewarding stories around dogma and doctrine that can actually harm people. And so I would say for folks in leadership, can you imagine creating a small group to whatever that small group might look like? It could look like 5 people, it could look like 20 people. But can you imagine stewarding a group of white folks and then see who's left in 10 years? And in that 10 years or in that 7 years, you've created a culture that then can be spread into your congregation. Not only have you created belonging with those who are left in the group, but you've created a condition for a different cultural practice to emerge. That is what I would say to people who are in leadership. We have got to, those of us who are the dominant culture, and I include myself because I'm a white passing Latinx, that we've got to actually steward stories that are going to make a difference in the world. And I don't know how else to do that other than practicing relationship. So many of our liturgies, so many of our practices are actually they're transactional. They mimic capitalism. They mimic the dominant culture. And as I understand it, the Christian church should be something that is set apart in stewarding a vision that is not of this world. And so I think those in leadership should be practicing doing this work with themselves and with those who are in their congregations. Is that helpful?
That's fantastic. And kind of building on that, we have another question from C. Michael Hahn, one of the global leaders of global hymnody, just one of our beloved members. And he writes the question, "This is a most helpful conversation. Increasingly, congregations are not making use of collections that have some kind of a filter or guidance of a hymnal committee, as many people are using music that they've taken from YouTube or CCLI. So they then become the arbiters. As before we were kind of talking about folks who might be on a hymnal committee, that kind of gives you some sort of filter or guidance by your denomination. But as folks increasingly move to just what's on CCLI, what's on YouTube, now they are the ones giving us the filters. So he asks, could you offer 3 practical questions that these folks might consider, since they are in essence their own hymnal editors and determiners of the narrative? They may have the best of intentions, but popularity seems to be more of a determining factor than thinking of singing as a shaper of the narrative. Good question.
That's a great question. Yeah. This is where I wish that we could be in person with one another, because this 2-dimensional platform is killing the vibe of togetherness. But I think that would be one of the questions that I would raise is, are we wanting to create togetherness in this song? Are we wanting to broaden our understanding of who is included in our community? You know, narrative, we are shapers of narrative, and narrative shapes us, right? And I think we have to be really serious about our ethics of togetherness, and whether we are practicing a virtue that invites togetherness in the choosing.
Brian says here he can promote everyone to a panelist, so it would then function like a meeting instead of a webinar.
Is that what we want? I don't know. What do we want?
Brian, would that allow us to see everyone?
Yeah, anyone who accepts the invitation to become a panelist, when it pops up on then they could share their video just like a meeting, and they would pop up into the grid of visible people. I mean, it would be kind of like webinar anarchy, but it's doable.
Yeah, I say let's do it.
All right, here we go.
I'm with Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Bainham.
Did that get to the heart of your question, Steph? Did that answer? Was that answer sufficient? I guess whoever asked it.
I'm gonna defer to the person who asked the question, but I think he says thank you. So
Okay, great.
But yeah, it's a really important question, and as particularly as a lot of people move away from having a hymnal where everything is just there, or even folks who make a bulletin where you have the opportunity to pick and choose from,
Right.
Any type of resource that you can find. It is a very different world, whereas, your church and your denomination would structure that narrative for you. And now each individual place really can construct their own narrative, and that comes with positives and negatives.
Yeah. Well, and we've been socialized just to accept the narrative given to us and to not question it. And I think what I'm inviting people to do is have an active analysis about the narrative that is shaping you. Because if it is not shaping you to steward and practice justice and equity, then it could be bad theology. Oh, it's good to see everyone.
Everyone should be able to share their video and unmute themselves. So please be generous or kind by keeping yourself on mute unless you have something to say, and then turning your mic back off after you're done so that we don't get echoes. And also, there was one more thing I was going to say. Oh, this is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, then turn your video off now.
Could you send the invitation one more time? It went very fast.
Well, everyone is currently a panelist, so you're good.
Great. Welcome to Webinar Anarchy. It's great to see folks. This is how we create conditions for togetherness, right? Where we actually can make changes that will create impact. This practice right here, what we're doing, I guarantee you will show up in someone's practice later on in the weeks or in the months. And that's important.
Well, now that we have everyone and we can see everyone and hear everyone, you had been really asking some questions and asking for feedback a little bit earlier. So I wonder if we can maybe go back to those questions that you had that you were hoping to get reflection from now that we can see and hear each other.
Yeah.
And respond with their.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what are the practices that folks have been embodying in these moments. You know, we're living in such strange times where church and gathering and community has made a sharp pivot for some people. For other people, it's not as sharp. I think for some on the underside, we have been used to meeting on the fly. And so I just would love to hear from folks. I'm going to mute myself so I can listen. I love what Anna has said here, stepping around the rules and customs that separate. Absolutely. I think part of our practice in church life, in congregational life, in community life, has been creating rules and customs that do harm producing theologies. And I think that shows up in our liturgies and our songs and whatnot. And actually saying to the rules and the practices and the traditions that separate to actually create togetherness through new customs is I think one of the things that we've got to be doing as a community.
I'll just jump in and repeat what I said earlier in the conversation, in the thing, and that is that we've been doing Zoom worship and doing a mix of both recorded traditional hymns, but also weaving in paperless song, and also singing those hymns that folks know live with one voice. So making sure that there's a continuum. And for me, the paperless song allows me to have a little bit more improvisation, a little bit more engagement, connectedness, relational sort of play back and forth.
Great, I love that.
Are you allowed to sing then? We're not allowed to sing in the UK. Therefore, there is an entirely songless, as far as the congregation goes, there is no song. And that is a very, very strange experience. And I've put on the chat that it privileges the leader in a way that I come from a congregational tradition. And people have retreated, the congregation has retreated so that we have even less voice than we did. People don't want to hear songs that are outside the tradition anymore. We don't want to have an outside person speaking to us. It's been an incredible retreat into wanting to be safe. And I don't know if that's the case. I would love to know how much impact song has had on that and what it's like over there.
Well, Janet, I would love to respond to that. And I'm sorry, I don't know your honorifics, and I apologize if calling you Janet is disrespectful. It's interesting to think about a voiceless community. That creates a kind of isolationism that could produce manifold harm. And as a scholar and as an activist and someone who's committed to a particular kind of feminism, we all have agency. And how do we create spaces where we can be agents of our own voice? And that's not to say that we can't steward togetherness with a multiplicity of voices. I think we can. And I think the danger of a single narrative, the danger of the patriarchy, is the embodiment of the single narrative and the voiceless congregation. Having a priest be the sole voice of a community is dangerous.
Well, I'm in the Episcopal Diocese of Western Oregon, or the Episcopal Diocese of Oregon is what we call it. And we sing on Zoom, and there is a socially distanced group of about 4 musicians that pre-records at the church. I mean, they're very far apart. There's an organist and 3 singers, and we sing along with them on Zoom. And so we basically do our singing on Zoom for the most part, but at least we get to do some singing. And then occasionally the priest will sing something on Zoom. He can sing a cappella and he has a beautiful voice, and we will sing along with him. So
I just put in the chat. I have a Quaker friend that I used to sing with a lot pre-COVID. And when all this started happening, I thought, well, this is kind of an interesting worship model for us. Like, if the people's voice is going to be limited, then maybe the leaders just need to be quiet too. And we can just sit together for a while. And I was like, it's not like that's a radical idea. Well, I guess it is a radical idea, but it's a radical idea from like a few centuries ago. So I've just, that's been rattling around in my head for a long time. And Janet's comments kind of brought it up in my mind again about, well, if the people are indeed if their voices are being silenced, then maybe the void is what is needed. And the inappropriate thing for leaders to do is just to try to fill that void.
Well, this goes to my own sort of pedagogy, which is a pedagogy of conversation. Why can't we steward that kind of pedagogy in our churches? Because right now what we have is we've got a single ordained person or a couple ordained people who are the voices of the congregation. And it's a passive kind of learning system. The U.S. education system is like that as well, where you have one teacher and students are expected to passively learn. And I think the Quakers have got something going on that is good that we can learn from. And also, you know, there have been communities of culture that have taught us how to steward a richer conversation where the multiplicity of voices are together as agents of change.
Robyn, I wonder if you could comment, something that Janet said also really struck me about the congregation retreating. And I've experienced that in my congregation, where our pastor actually made the move to using some more inclusive language for things such as the creed and as the confession. And some members, that's always going to be unsettling for folks. But the thing was, people were asking, why would you be doing that now in the middle of the pandemic? So there's a sense that during this really difficult time, people need things that are comforting them. As Janet said, people are really retreating. And so I wonder if you could speak to this tension of particularly with everything that's been going on with Black Lives Matter and those movements, and wanting to respond to that and push folks versus we're in the middle of a pandemic and folks are really fearful and uncomfortable. And I wonder if you could speak to that tension.
I can try. I'm not an
Sorry, it's
expert.
not an easy question.
Part of me wants to say that there are some people, and when I mean some people, I mean some white people, who are just waking up and who are in need of more of the same. And there's some people who are in need because maybe they're more comfortable in this ambiguous space where they need a pivot. I think all of us have a different relationship to the unknown. And for a lot of us, and I think this goes globally, we are living in the unknown. And I don't know that we have good pastoral care or good theology around the unknown. And I think that a lot of people are just grasping at practices and doing their best. I don't want to criticize, because for a lot of people, folks are doing what they think they should be doing. Now, it might be the wrong thing to be doing, but I would want the community to be the one to call in, right? Instead of a society or some institution, right? Like, because I think that's our moment right now. We're in a moment of community conscience. And if we can be connected to our varying communities and call in the practices that are harming, and make a choice to listen, and not in a transactional way, but listen with the body. I think that's part of what needs to happen. I think these are monumental, difficult times for everyone. And I think we need more care with one another. I don't know if that answers the question, but the pastor in me is that's where that response comes from.
I would like to offer a thought about what we've been doing. Can you hear me?
I can barely hear you.
Oh, I'll speak loudly. We've been doing pre-recorded services, and we've been recording 2 hymns every week, which is much less than we usually would do. But what we've done is have people record the hymns in their homes with whoever lives with them. And it's been quite enlightening to see all the different variety that we get. And it gives people a voice in a way that they never had it when they're singing in a larger group. Of course, we lose a lot because we can't sing in a large group together. But it has been instructive to see how many different singers and how many different kind of understandings of hymns and interpretations of hymns that we can hear in our own congregation just by inviting people to do that. And we don't try to sort of aspire to a certain kind of excellence. We let everybody do the best that they can. And that's been interesting to see what comes out of that.
Great. I know that I have been a part of different worshiping communities as a preacher, and I think it's been great for different congregations to steward multiple voices, preaching voices. which I've really enjoyed being a part, of these preaching opportunities. The communion piece is where I get tripped up because many of these congregations are church starts, and so they have a very low church, sort of a low ecclesiology, and so the elements they invite you to use whatever elements you have lying around, coffee cake and milk, or Oreo and coffee. It's been very interesting. So I have appreciated that, what I would say very queer practice. And I have also, there's been a part of me that is kind of like, oh, can we have just one thing that is normal in our worshiping experience? Steph, were there other questions, or did other folks have thoughts or insights or questions?
I've been trying to keep track, but I would invite folks, now that we're able to see and hear each other, to jump in and offer their questions or comments to you themselves.
I have a question for those that are present. I mentioned my grandmother's hands earlier and was wondering, I threw in the question, has anybody heard of that book? And if you have, has anybody worked with their congregation or, invited folks into a read of it? I've seen, okay, 3 or 4. Great.
This is Nancy Fowles. I'm in a book group, 4 of us who are reading that book right now. It's an interesting question you ask, because I'm not sure that I'd take it to my congregation right now. We're really deeply involved, and every week we take 2 hours together and just read one chapter. And the author really pushes us to work on the situations that we face. I recommend the book for everybody. I don't know what I'd do. Of course, our congregations can't meet anyway, so I'm grateful just to have a book group that can get together on Zoom and do it.
Towards the end of the book, there's part 3 is about the community culture shifting. And I'm very curious where folks of faith find themselves in that and how to apply it. And so I put my email in the chat. If I'd love this conversation. I would love to stay connected if you want to. So the offer is open.
Hi, it's Margaret Leask here in Waterloo. Forgive the mask. I have a PSW here working with my husband, so they've gone out and I can take it down. But the question is that idea of normal. What is normal? I find that fascinating. And for what it's worth, I'll share it with you and you can think about it. I've thought about Mary Oyer and her idea of memory bank hymns. Is that normal? Is that what we're missing? And what are memory bank hymns? Her point is valid. That's how we pass on our traditions from one generation to another. It's what we choose to share as corporate message. Although, to be fair, that's determined by the congregations and the leadership too. But what is normal, and is normal related to memory bank?
I think that what was before COVID was also not normal. And I think that we are coming into an awareness, a fuller vision of who we can be with ourselves and with each other. I think certainly COVID has highlighted that. But I don't want to say that the greed and the capitalism and the productivity was normal before COVID.
Back to the idea of memory bank. Is memory bank greed and capitalism? I'm not sure. I think what I'm trying to put forward is the idea that our past, our present, and our future are connected. What we choose of our past to carry into our future is, I think, where we can lead change. And I think if we look in our past, we will see that others have experienced this. What we know about our past tends to be what's popular or well-known among ourselves. But past, present, and future are linked. That's a tough one. And the future isn't always better. And that's where I think memory bank provides an anchor. Myself, memory bank is what we accept as, if I understand Maria, and it's not fair to put it to her, but I've been trying to figure out what is memory bank. I think that those are the tracks that we run on, the ones that work. And we try different tracks at different times. We take a side trail, and then for whatever reasons, we will find our way to center trail. It doesn't mean center trail is straight, back to forward, because I think we shape our center trail by our experience. And if we make one center trail common for everyone, then we're really missing the point, for one thing. And if we make it rigid, we're really missing the point because we're living in the past. How do we connect past, present, and future, I think, is behind this question that we're talking about today. And not making an assumption that future is always perfect. For what it's worth, I'm an historian. Historians look at things as past, present, and future. So how do we use this conversation to shape our future? And what are the references we're using for that? Okay.
May I respond to that? There is an excellent article in the Episcopal Hymnal, what's it called, the Guide or whatever, which talks about concentric circles, that we start with a new hymn, and the new hymn might be absolutely perfect for the time. And then if the hymn's going to stand the test of time, it's going to keep moving further and further out so that it becomes less and less about specific experience and more about the wider experience. And this is a very old example, you know, nobody sings Onward Christian Soldiers anymore. I have not experienced communities who would sing that hymn anymore, because it communicates something that we no longer want to communicate about who we are. And then the new hymns are coming in that express the voice of people who have not been heard before, and will then go through that same purpose, same process. So that's how I see it, that we constantly, but what we cannot do is keep old material that is offensive to some because it's old material, or put barriers around new material because we don't want to hear new voices. So if we turn those into positives rather than those negatives, those are the two things I think that have to be changing all the time.
I think there's another exciting thing, and that is that the past has got lots and lots of unheard voices that are being heard now. And one of the things that the feminist enterprise did in the 1970s, and obviously much long before that as well, was to start flapping our ears and picking up voices that, and they're still emerging, which is lovely. The other thing I wanted to say at this point is that there's a real moment at the moment, certainly in this side of the Atlantic, in how we decolonize our history. That's been mentioned here, but it's statues over here. Do we knock down statues? And we've just had a new statue erected and monument for Mary Wollstonecraft, and people hate it because she was this nasty radical feminist. They love it because she was this wonderful radical feminist. They hate it because it's a modern statue and isn't a picture of her that you would recognize. Or they love it because it's a modern statue and is an image of women being shot into the future by the past. And it's so complicated, but I think there's a moment here, a real moment, when if we could grab this moment and allow the past to disintegrate and reform around us, we could have a different past to take into the future and then a different future. If any of that makes sense.
Yeah, that's the struggle, right? I mean, I think the question of past, present, and future, and what you've just illustrated, Janet, as a contemporary example, is the question. Is there reconciliation with any of it? And should there be?
I wonder if there's even conciliation before we even get to reconciliation. How do we get there?
That's an interesting point from a Canadian perspective. Reconciliation is a very big topic for us. And out of the First Nations experience, for one thing, but not only. Your idea of conciliation and then reconciliation. I'm going to think about it. Thank you. Start at the Oxford Dictionary and then keep going. That's because that's an interest. What is reconciliation? Is a tough question. And I think it's related to the conversation today.
I think we're getting close to our time together, and I wanted to hand it back to Robyn if they have any last minute thoughts or parting questions for us to ponder and think about as we end this really enriching conversation.
I think the only last thing I would say is we should be doing more of this kind of conversation together. And what is your practice? I want to leave you with a question. What is your practice? Because if we don't have a practice that is stewarding equity and liberation and justice, then we're just perpetuating the bullshit that creates toxic harm. And so what is your practice? And an invitation to continue these kinds of conversations like this, instead of having one expert. When I do these talks, I never call it Q&A. I call it Q&R, because I don't believe that I have the answer. I believe that I can only have a response, and that the answer comes in collective wisdom. And so I think we need to be having more of these kinds of conversations so that we can steward our communities in the ways that we envision justice. I'm glad that we were all here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robyn. The best way to show, to like applaud or clap or show thanks on Zoom is to give the old jazz hands. So if you want to do that to show your appreciation for Dr. Robyn being here, we're really grateful. And I've learned a lot, and I've been able to reflect a lot. And so thank you from me and on behalf of the Hymn Society.